Hello, Telvani here, and today I'd like to share with you my pure elemental Omniscience Tornado Shot Raider. All memes aside, I did take a lot of inspiration from some of the big content creators like Crouching Tuna and Path of Math when creating this build, and I'll be leaving a link to their channels in the description below. So without further ado, let's get into it. Why Tornado Shot? Tornado Shot is, well, probably my favorite skill in the entire game. I remember watching Grimro videos in the pre-Cirrus days, where he was zooming around on a deadeye Windripper Tornado Shot build, running infinite Elder Burial Chambers, and I've been in love with the skill ever since. Tornado Shot builds have come a long way since then, however, and Tornado Shot now offers some of the best single target as well as the best clear speed in the game. If you pull up my PoE, you can see my Tornado Shot on paper does about 5 million DPS. And while that might not seem like much, you need to keep in mind that that damage is per arrow. And as you can see, every time I am firing, I shoot 6 arrows. And we could even increase this further by running something like Awakened GMP. So off that alone, we are looking at something around 30 million damage per second, which is more than enough damage to clear all content in the game. And that is not even including the extra damage from our totems. Alright. So we've established why Tornado Shot. But more importantly, and the most frequent question I get asked, why Raider? Why not Deadeye? What it really boils down to at the end of the day is defenses. Raider is an incredibly defensive class. It receives free phasing, spell suppression, ailment avoidance, increased evasion, and movement speed. It also has incredible damage with frenzy charge scaling, and some of the strongest exposure available. And with the introduction of the Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame jewels, Deadeye's biggest offensive advantage of +2 additional projectiles is now on the table as well. Most of the time when I take a look at a Deadeye build, I'm going to see quite a few issues, a couple of which I alluded to at the beginning of this video. The first of which is low life. A lot of Deadeye players are running around with less than 3.5k life because they are heavily reliant on numerous uniques. They'll grab Asenath's Chant because they don't have built-in exposure and don't want to self-cast Hydrosphere. They'll grab Hiri's Ire because they don't have easy access to spell suppression. This detriment is twofold, as not only does Hiri's Ire not have any life, but it also doesn't grant any armor. Which brings me to another issue with a lot of Deadeye builds. Quite a few of them are not even running Determination. They're reliant on Grace exclusively. Evasion alone is not a sufficient defensive layer. Evasion is entropy based, which means that eventually you are guaranteed to get hit. And without any armor, if that hit is a physical based attack, you are going to get one shot. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Another problem I often see is the heavy usage of the Interrogation Small Cluster Jewel. This is usually because they didn't build properly into crit chance. Secrets of Suffering may seem like a great shortcut to damage, but you lose the ability to freeze your enemies, which is another critical defensive layer. And since you need to apply Brittle before you get access to 100% critical strike chance, you will often need to shoot several times before you will clear a pack of monsters, giving them even more opportunities to hit you. The final thing I often see, even in very well-rounded characters with high HP pools, is a lack of chaos resistance. Capped chaos resistance is an absolute must, especially if you want to be able to do simulacrums consistently. Even on a character with 30k armor, if you have negative chaos resistance, you are going to get randomly one-shot sometimes by chaos damage. And don't even get me started on maps with desecrated ground. There certainly is some merit in the Deadeye philosophy of kill everything before I can kill you. However, at the end of the day, I prefer a more balanced approach. Raider's built-in defenses and offenses allow you to forego some unique items, which in turn give you easier access to a larger life pool. Their suppression and ailment avoidance also free up a lot of suffix pressure, and this allows you to pick up things like chaos resistance. Coming down from last league's lightning strike meta of 250,000 effective hit point raiders, 3.3k life, 20k effective hit point Deadeye bow builds just aren't doing it for me, which is why I made this Raider bow build. However, at extremely high investment levels, and we're talking more than several mirrors here, I'm sure the Deadeye could find a way to shore up the holes in their defenses. Just look at Kobe Black Mamba. He professed that his Tornado Shot Berserker sucked at 3 mirror investment, and it wasn't until he invested over 5 mirrors into the build that he said it finally felt comfortable. So ultimately, I think Raider is a more convenient and more accessible class for defense and a comfortable playstyle. But if you think I missed anything on the Raider Deadeye conversation, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. And with that out of the way, we'll dive right into the build. I would like to preface this part of the video with the fact that my current POB is about 1.5 mirrors worth of gear. Over half of that is the bow and the headhunter. So it's not as insanely expensive as something like Kobe's build, but it is a bit pricey. However, as I said at the beginning of the video, we have over 30 million damage and potentially more like 60 million with totems up. And you could probably do with half as much damage as I have and still be sitting pretty comfortably. So if you want to try out this build, just pick up something within your budget. Just keep in mind, you may need to troubleshoot some of the problems you run into on your own. Alright, so this build is an Omniscience build. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with it, but very quickly, Omniscience allows you to convert attributes into elemental resistances and elemental penetration. It is the biggest reason bow builds are back this league, as it allows us to easily get defenses and damage. I'm running the Sovereignty Anoint on my amulet, which gives us increased mana reservation and aura effect. Next up, we are running a tri-elemental bow, ideally with additional arrows, crit, and attack speed. I really recommend trying to use a spine bow as it has the best of both worlds for attack rate and base crit chance. However, something like an Imperial bow or a Thicket bow could work for you. For the very end game, I might consider using a pure physical bow and converting to elemental instead, as this would allow us to better utilize Headhunter. However, for most players, this probably won't be an option, and without a Headhunter, this would actually be less damage than a tri-elemental bow. Here we have our quiver. The most important thing for the quiver is +1 arrows. After that, it's whatever you can find. There are a lot of damage options out there, but there are also a lot of defensive options, like high life rolls, resistances, and attributes. For our helmet, we need an evasion base, preferably evasion armor hybrid, as evasion is required to roll spell suppression, and armor is just good in general. So on the evasion base, you want reduced mana cost of attacks, as well as mana reservation efficiency Eldritch Implicits. You'll also want to roll these with a deafening loathing essence to get a further 10% mana reservation efficiency on skills, as we use a lot of auras for offenses and defenses. After that, it's really whatever defenses you need and ideally life. You'll also want a +1 Tornado Shot secondary projectile enchant. For those of you who don't know, enemies can only be hit by a single projectile from each Tornado Shot explosion. So this isn't as powerful as it sounds. It doesn't increase the number of arrows you are firing, just the secondary explosion projectiles coming out from the arrows, which will indirectly increase our damage, since more secondary projectiles increase the likelihood of enemies getting hit, but it's not a direct more multiplier. Next, we have our chest. Again, you'll want an evasion base for suppression, and ideally evasion armor hybrid. You'll want to grab non-curse aura and determination aura effect Eldritch Implicits for both increased damage and increased defenses. We also want high life and either an open prefix for avoid ailment craft or an Aisling slammed ailment avoidance. For suffixes, the usual resistances, attributes, and spell suppression based on your build's needs. Every build is a little different, so balance where you need to for you. Our gloves are pretty flexible. I like Rage on Hit with attacks, as it is very nice for mapping and simulacrums. And I've also grabbed Spell Suppression as my second Eldritch Implicit, so I could drop Suppression on another piece of gear. However, it's really up to you on what you'd like to use. Again, suffixes are resists, attributes, or spell suppression as needed. I took a Temple Craft, which gives increased damage against chilled enemies, but this is completely optional. Finally, we have our boots here, and they're a pretty expensive traditional pair of double elevated tailwind boots. But for the average player, you can honestly just grab a pair of Dark Rays, as they will give you really similar damage and defenses. Keep in mind that for most builds using Omniscience, the enchantment Flat Added Lightning, if you haven't killed recently, is usually stronger than damage penetrates percent of elemental resistances if you haven't killed recently, since we already have a very large amount of elemental penetration from using Omniscience. Our rings, I have chosen Amethyst rings, as this gives us free chaos resistance. For suffixes, it is the usual resistance, attributes, or spell suppression as needed. For prefixes, however, make sure you have an open prefix to craft on non-channeling skills have -7 to total mana cost. This is very important for sustaining our mana, as we have a very high attack rate. Finally, we have our belt here. I am using a Headhunter, but you could easily swap that out for a Mage Blood if you wanted more defenses from Flasks. You could also swap it out for a Stygian Vise if you can't afford either. The Stygian Vise would actually give you even more access to defensive suffixes, so that's actually a pretty big win for a budget build. For my Flasks, I am running a Corrupting Blood Immune Life Flask. Diamond, Silver, and Granite Flasks are pretty mandatory. However, this Jade Flask is a bit of a flex spot, and you could swap it out for something else if you wanted, like a Quicksilver Flask. Alright, on to the skill tree. Nothing too exciting here. We are using a pretty traditional Lionized Fall in the Shadow Socket here to convert these nodes to bow nodes. I've also been experimenting with using an Unnatural Instinct here, as it is pretty point efficient, but I am not sold on it, as you lose a lot from the Dagger and Claw nodes without Lionized Fall. We are running Lethal Pride, which is pretty important, as it grants small passives, flat strength, and also gives us access to Intimidate and double damage, as well as some increased attributes. And finally, the last thing of note is the Cluster Jewels. A lot of builds will grab these Leech nodes up here. However, if you get Feed the Fury and Fuel the Fight on your Cluster Jewels, you can forego that entirely. Another option on a budget is to grab the Leech node here for 1 point, although you will miss out on some of the life gained on hit. So in conclusion, I think Tornado Shot Raider is incredibly strong. It might not have the same damage output as some of these super squishy Glass Cannon Deadeye variants out there, but it definitely more than makes up for it with its easy access to defensive layers. Thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit that like button. Good luck with your league, take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.